All right, so we just talked about the background to the war. We talked about what happened at the end of World War I. We talked about the Soviet Union. Now we're going to talk about the United States and what's going on in Europe. Okay, what's going on in Europe. At this point in Europe, we've got this guy. Right, 1933, we've got Adolf Hitler, who becomes Chancellor of Germany. Adolf Hitler, to look at him, he doesn't look like much. But Hitler's sort of this master of propaganda. He looks like this little scrawny guy. He's got this cadre of doctors constantly following him everywhere he goes because of his injuries from World War I. But he comes out to his podium carrying his speech. And every time he does one of these big rallies or everything, even though Germany is a very technological, advanced culture, these rallies are usually held at night, and there's banners with stark colors, and there's torches, and there's bonfires, and there's all of this sort of Gothic imagery that he's taking advantage of. He carries his little speech out there, and you can watch him. If you watch a news clip of one of Hitler's speeches, he starts out sort of holding on to his podium, and he's basically speaking to the people, and then he'll look up and gesture, and then he'll continue to read, and then he'll look up and gesture, and then he'll continue to read, and his cadence starts to speed up, and then he'll look up and gesture, and then he'll gesture, and he'll gesture, and before you know it, he's got everybody pumped in the audience. Hitler is a very charismatic individual. I was watching a History Channel documentary about the Jews in Vienna, and the educated Jews in Vienna. One of the Jewish students at the university was invited to come to one of these rallies, and he wasn't sure what he was, why he was going, but he was going to go just to see what all this hoopla is about. He said, and this is the guy, he was still alive, he was talking in an interview, he said when it started he was hearing the same old propaganda he had always heard and things like that. But by the end of the night, he found himself going Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil, right along with the rest of the Germans. Why? Well, he believed it was because Hitler had tapped into something about him that was German rather than his Judaism, his genetic heritage. This guy believed that this was dangerous, and apparently, according to the interview, after this meeting, he actually left Vienna. He left the university and got out because he knew that if Hitler could cause him to start espousing those kinds of ideas, there's no telling what he was going to be able to do to the rest of the Germans. So Hitler is attempting to preach this notion to the German people that the other nations of Europe, especially the British and the French, have been punishing them for long enough with this Treaty of Versailles. And they are going to reunite German culture and bring German culture back together. And so Hitler's going to orchestrate this move to consolidate the Austria and Hungary back with Germany, because those are the German-speaking regions. Okay? Now, other places, Chamberlain. Well, you got William Chamberlain here. Chamberlain was a prime minister. In 1938, Chamberlain, who, over fears that Hitler was going to start a rampage through Europe, attempts to get a peace agreement called the Munich Accords, the Munich Agreement, which is between the French and the British and the Germans and the Italians, which basically says that the Allies, the French and the British, are going to concede to Hitler the Czechoslovakian region that was German-speaking, called the Sudetenland. Okay, Hitler said all he wanted to do was to bring all the culturally German peoples back together. Chamberlain, desperate for two things. Number one, not to get into a war, and number two, not to have to form an alliance with the Soviet Union, who had bailed on them during World War One. So when Hitler signs this agreement, Chamberlain comes home and he's ecstatic. He believes he's brought peace for our time. And then the Germans march into the Sundaland. But shortly thereafter, the German troops start marching into the rest of Czechoslovakia and occupying it and making plans to start invading Poland. Okay? At which point there was nothing that Chamberlain could do. In comes Winston Churchill. Okay? Winston Churchill comes on the scene. Churchill had been in the Parliament. He was a long-time parliamentarian. He had been critical of the German regime. He had been sounding alarm bells over the advances, all the development going on in Germany. He was trying to warn the British people, but people like Chamberlain were afraid he was going to antagonize the Germans and cause another war. Well, the Germans apparently didn't need any antagonization. And so Churchill will wind up being the person who is made prime minister, and he starts movements towards declaring war on Germany. Now, the rest of Europe, like the United States, is going through a kind of Great Depression. Okay, it's not just the United States, it's not unique to us, but France and England, they're also going through this Great Depression. The countries that aren't, the countries that have come out of the Great Depression, have been the Germans, the Italians here under Benito Mussolini, and of course Hirohito in Japan, and then on the other side, Joseph Stalin, who has taken control of the Soviet Union in 1924 when Lenin dies. These countries who have reestablished their economies based on war preparations, building all kinds of weapons and machineries, are out of their depressions. They no longer have the massive unemployment and the shortages and things like that we still have in America, which causes people in the United States like Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh, Robert Young, a number of other very famous celebrity type peoples to look at FDR and say, you leave those National Socialists alone. They seem to know what they're doing. They've gotten their people out of their Great Depression. You need to leave them alone and let them do what they do. Well, Mussolini is going to become the darling of the Italian public simply because, as the Italians will tell you, he got the trains running on time. And so since the trains are running on time, he must be the one. Now, the map I have here is designed to illustrate the fact that the World War II is in reality 3 different conflicts, 3 different separate conflicts that arise, and when the United States enters the war, then all 3 of those conflicts get combined into one massive global enterprise. Okay, the first war, okay, between the Germans and the French and the British. The first war is between the Germans. When the Germans go into the Sundaland and then invade Poland, England and Great Britain and France are going to declare war. And when they do, the Germans are going to invade France. They use that same sleeping plan that I showed you from World War I, except this time Hitler's got the kind of equipment that it can take to do it. And in just a short time, the northern half of France is occupied by the Germans. The southern part of France, which is called the Vichy French, the Germans set up a puppet government to basically say that the French are still governing themselves, but they are French government individuals who are in support of the Nazi regime. Okay. While the Germans are doing that, the Italians are invading all over North Africa. The Germans are coming into North Africa, and because the French are now occupied by the German, all of the French territories in North Africa are now also under German control. Okay, That's the first war. The first war that we're concerned with is a war between Germany and France and England. Between Germany and France and England. Okay? The second war happens in the fall of 1941. See, this war starts, I guess, basically in 1938. Okay? In fall of 1941, the Germans are going to invade the Soviet Union. The Germans are going to invade the Soviet Union. As you'll see shortly, it's basically breaking a treaty that the Germans had signed with the Soviet Union. But we'll get to more of that in just a second. So the second war from 1941, from the middle of autumn in 1941 until the winter of 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the second war is this war between the Germans, who have now invaded Poland and now are going to invade into Russia. It's a bloody and brutal conflict between the Germans and the Russians. There are a number of films. One of them that is really telling is about the Battle of Stalingrad. It's called The Enemy at the Gates. Really good film. Now, the third conflict that I was talking about. So we've got the war between England and France and Germany. Then you've got the war between Germany and the Soviet Union. Now you've got a conflict that's taking place in Asia. Back in 1931, the Japanese had invaded Manchuria, had come across the Korean Peninsula, which basically invading the Korean Peninsula first, and then they've invaded into Manchuria, and they start coming down into China. The reasons for this expanse is because as the Japanese are invading Manchuria and making their way down into mainland China, the nations of the world cut off the Japanese oil supply. We cut off the Japanese oil supply in hopes that we can drive them out of China. Now, prior to this, the United States had another plan under FDR, but we'll finish this plan first. What happened when we cut off the oil? The Japanese were getting more than 70% of its oil for its fledgling infrastructure from the United States, and when we cut off their oil, the Japanese decided that all they have to do is come down here and get the oil that they need from the Dutch East Indies. There's nobody there who's going to be focusing on them, and even if Burma, even if England were to try to intercede, the Burmese, the people in England, are focused on Adolf Hitler. The people in Vietnam are under French colonial control. So since the French are allies of the Germans, the French are also allies of the Japanese. The only problem is that in order to get this oil to Japan, it has to come past the Philippines, which the Philippines and Guam and Wake Island and the Marshall Islands, these are all American holdings. These are all American holdings. If the United States gets involved in the conflict, then that could be the only problem. The only problem for the Chinese to this plan is the naval base at Pearl Harbor. The naval base at Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941, the Japanese will launch a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor and in an attempt to cripple the fleet. And it almost succeeds. It's very successful. I've got a couple film clips to show you. The movie called Pearl Harbor, it looks as if every single bomb the Japanese drops landed, but in reality there was a lot of failures. Only about 45% of the torpedoes that were dropped in the water from these dive bombers actually find their mark on a ship. The others will hit the dock and will wind up going aground. And out of all the ships bombed at Pearl Harbor, only 2 never returned to duty. One's the Arizona which is still currently at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. All the other ships are able to be repaired and returned to active duty, except for the two. Now, as soon as the Japanese throw this lasso around, we're forced to evacuate the Philippines after Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese will invade, and they will start moving towards like Papua New Guinea and towards Australia. It's at this point that we will stop the Japanese expansion, right? And then just prior to that, this battle at Midway, which I think there's a film coming out just recently about the Battle of Midway, if you want to watch some of that. Now, so once the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, the United States declares war on the Japanese. Because the Japanese are allies with the Germans are forced to declare war on the United States. Once Germany declares war on the United States can now do exactly what they wanted to do, join the British in fighting the Germans. And so we declare war on the Germans, and we declare war on the Italians, and we declare war on the Japanese. And once we do that, we consolidate all of these conflicts, especially the one in Russia, which for a lot of people it still boggles their mind. Even Winston Churchill was a little leery about trying to side with the Soviet Union to fight the Germans. But FDR had a simple philosophy. He said, "The enemy of my enemy is my enemy." And the only way we defeated the Germans in World War I was to force them to fight on two fronts. And FDR convinces Churchill that we need to ally ourselves with the Soviet Union so that the Soviets can put the pressure on the Germans on the Eastern Front, so that to give the Allies time to mass for a large invasion. Okay, which I'll show you a couple clips from the D-Day invasion also. Now, this thing with the Soviet Union, this is the thing I want you to look at. Where Japan is here, and Manchuria, this part of China, and Korea, FDR's first plan of attack wasn't to cut off the oil, but it was to make an alliance with the Soviet Union. This gets him into trouble politically because there's a lot of, simply the Red Scare and everything, people don't trust the communists. But the Soviet Union comes all the way down here, and traditionally, the Soviet Union, the Russians have always had conflicts with Japan over these string of islands right here. The peace treaty that Teddy Roosevelt brokered between the Russians and the Japanese was over those islands. Roosevelt wants to make a deal with the Soviet Union. If you will support us in forcing the Japanese out of China, then we will recognize the Soviet Union as the legitimate government of Russia. We will also give to the Russians all of our mothballed fleet. We've got our brand new fleet, and we were going to give them all of our old ships, our old battleships, and our old destroyers. And so it looked like in 1936 we were going to have a deal. It looked like we were going to have a deal. Again, it cost FDR some conflict. Back in 1932, the problem was, how do we stop Japan? In 1936, because FDR started talking about this plan, Hearst, the newspaper editor, says that the 1936 election, Roosevelt would be the unofficial candidate of the Comintern, the Communist International. Even anti-labor groups said, join the CIO and help build a better Soviet America. Right? We were associating what he was doing with siding with the communists. Okay? In 1937, 1938, New Deal aspects were challenged. Some people believe because of these sort of fears of creeping socialism into the government. And in 1938, a committee in the House of Representatives is created called the House Un-Americans Activities Committee, being led by Martin Dies. Now, eventually, Richard Nixon will wind up on this House Un-Americans Activities Committee, and Nixon is actually going to uncover a spy, which we'll talk about later. Now, interesting political bedfellows this kind of arrangement makes. It allows rivals to sort of, the Catholic Church, who is staunchly anti-Catholic, with the Ku Klux Klan. Even though the Ku Klux Klan is anti-Catholic, both of them are anti-communist. And then the anti-union businessmen and the American Legion, and even fundamentalist Protestants are going to preach against these guys. Now, in 1924, Lenin had died, major conflicts, and Stalin is going to rise to the top. Stalin's going to rise to the top. He had been a member of the Central Committee. I know Photoshop wasn't invented back then, but I'm really not sure if Lenin and Stalin were that close in Lenin's early days. Stalin is portrayed as the soldier and Lenin as sort of the intellectual. In reality, Lenin's right-hand man was this guy. His name is Trotsky. That is not Stalin. 1933, we offer official recognition. Stalin, the man of steel, sees this as his opportunity. Hitler starts killing Communist Party members, and so Stalin sees a reason why to join with the Americans. He orders the Comintern to cooperate with any fascist governments that are in Europe. In 1938, pressure from the East and from the West are going to force Stalin's hand, and he's going to have to do something. Now, one thing the United States doesn't know. Beginning in 1936, the Germans had approached Stalin with a plan. The Germans told the Russians, "We are being punished by the Treaty of Versailles just as you were. You lost all of this land, Finland and Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and the Ukraine. You lost all of that territory in the Treaty of Versailles." The Germans make a proposal of truce, that if the Soviets will promise not to be aggressive against the Germans, that the Soviets can reconquer this territory, and the Germans won't lift a finger. The Germans won't lift a finger. So the Russians see this as an opportunity to regain all their fledgling infrastructure, all their steel and coal production, and things like that. They keep it a secret from the United States. They don't let us know. But when we start putting pressure on the Russians to help us with the Japanese, the Soviets come out with, well, we've got this non-aggression treaty with Hitler. That means we also have a non-aggression treaty with Japan. And so essentially the communists stabbed us in the back with this thing. In 1940, almost as an act of retaliation, the Smith Act is created, which makes acts of sedition illegal. Basically, all you need for sedition is to declare yourself a communist and have ideas that would lead towards the overthrow of America. It's then that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, because once our plan A failed, we have to cut off their oil. And when we cut off their oil, that's what's going to cause the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor. And once they attack Pearl Harbor, we are drawn into this conflict. I've got a couple of video clips that you'll be watching at the end of this. Once this is over, it has to do with the attack on Pearl Harbor, has to do with D-Day, and so take a look at those and continue to work on your quizzes.